Today's sex work carries a ton of stigma, mostly due to our society's view of sexuality and the criminalization of full-service sex work. Historically, though, sex workers have been held at a high regard. Courtesans, for example, were fashion trendsetters and status symbols, valued for their ability to influence and converse with powerful, intelligent men. Courtesans were educated and often talented women who worked as professional mistresses or escorts, known to offer sexual, emotional, and mental stimulation. Hello, lovely beings. Welcome to my channel. My name is Amanda Savignon. I'm a sexual wellness educator and coach. I talk about all things sex, love, intimacy, and encourage you to shine as your most authentic self. There may be a lot of stigma around some of the topics I discuss on my channel, so I do recommend coming with an open heart and mind. Now, let's get to it. So what is sex work? Basically, it's anyone who works in sex, sexuality, or kink at varying levels of interaction. I go over what sex work is and isn't, as well as different types of sex work in my previous video, Sex Work Part 1. In this video, I'll be discussing the criminalization of sex work and how it creates an unsafe work environment for sex workers. I also go over the differences between decriminalization and legalization of sex work, as I've heard these terms being used interchangeably, usually with good intention, but it's important to understand that they're not the same. Let's first talk about full criminalization. Full criminalization of sex work is the most widely practiced legal strategy for regulating transactional sex. Full criminalization is practiced in China, Russia, and the majority of countries in Africa. In the US, each state has its own criminal code, but full contact sex work is illegal everywhere. Sex work using a condom is legal only in parts of Nevada, and non-contact sex work is a gray and confused area. So under full criminalization, the seller, buyer, and any third party involved are subject to criminal penalties. Criminalization has been linked to higher rates of sexually transmitted infections, partner violence, and police harassment. Research conducted by Human Rights Watch showed that this is because criminalization causes fear of legal ramifications and can therefore deter sex workers from seeking proper sexual health care services and discourage them from reporting crimes of which they were the victim. This makes sex workers more vulnerable to rape, murder, and discrimination. I've heard so many stories where sex workers were raped or robbed by a client or police officer, in which the abuser pretty much mockingly asks, "What are you gonna do? Call the police?" Partial criminalization, also known as Neo-Abolitionism or the Swedish Nordic model, aka the end man model, is used in Sweden, Norway, France, and other countries. Advocates of this approach argue that even though sex workers may choose to enter the trade, it is nevertheless immoral and an oppressive form of labor. I wonder whether this would help or hinder sex workers from gaining respect and safety at work. Seems like it would only contribute to the existing stigma, disrespect, and abuse. While selling sex is not criminalized under this approach, the buying of sex is illegal. Neo-abolitionists claim these models do not punish sex workers, but instead penalize those who purchase sex from sex workers. This model is criticized for causing sex workers to do their business in areas with less police, which often makes it more dangerous. The abolitionist perspective views prostitution and trafficking as directly and intimately connected, and therefore calls for the abolition of prostitution in efforts to eliminate the overall sexual exploitation of women and children. Abolitionists also refute the idea of consent among sex workers by claiming that such consent is merely a submissive acceptance of the traditional exploitation of women. For these reasons, abolitionists believe that decriminalizing sex work would only harm women as a class by maintaining their sexual and economic exploitation while serving the interests of pimps and prostituters. I completely understand this perspective and I understand where it's coming from. Y'all know there's about to be a but this argument stems from the belief that sex work is immoral and implies that a person cannot be a sex worker and like what they do or feel empowered and sexually expressive within their work. This perspective in and of itself sounds oppressive. Also, sex work is not the same as human trafficking. One more time for those in the back. Sex work is not the same as human trafficking. Oh my gosh, we really need to clear up this misconception. Sex work is consensual. Human trafficking is non-consensual. It involves rape and enslavement. They're two different things. Sex workers have the right to change their mind and revoke consent at any time. being a sex worker does not change this human right. Now, I invite you to consider one key factor that is absent from this abolitionist logic, and that would be education and empowerment, but that can result from better education. The true problem lies within the foundation. It's our society's values and views of sexuality, oppression of women, which of course includes trans women, that encourages exploitation and abuse. Imagine for a moment that we live in a society that educates and empowers women, and really all people, to embrace their body and sexuality. Imagine we encourage healthy communication, compassion, and respect. In a society like this, women, but really all people, would have more agency over their bodies, practice safer sex, and fully understand what it means to consent. They would practice sex work from a space in which they have more control, more of a voice, and more respect. Sexual exploitation and abuse of women is not something pertaining exclusively to sex work. Are we not aware of the Me Too movement? Let's come back to the point, which is that education is needed. And I don't mean abstinence-based or shame-based sex ed. The true issue is at the core or foundation. Ignoring it and smacking a band-aid on it is not going to solve anything. We need to flip it upside down, turn things inside out, and really get to the root of these issues. I think that part of this can start with the decriminalization of sex work. So, what's the difference between decriminalization and legalization? With legalization comes regulation, whereas decriminalization pretty much treats sex work just as any other work. Legalization would mean the regulation of prostitution with laws regarding where, when, and how prostitution can take place. Widely presented as a more tolerant and pragmatic approach, the legalized model still criminalizes those sex workers who cannot or will not fulfill various bureaucratic responsibilities and therefore retains some of the worst harms of criminalization. It disproportionately excludes sex workers who are already marginalized, like people who use drugs or who are undocumented. This makes their situation more precarious and also reinforces the power of exploitative managers. If only there was an alternative that made sex work not illegal, didn't apply regulations, and pretty much treated it as any other work. That's where decriminalization comes in. Decriminalization does just that. Decriminalizes it by removing criminal penalties for sex work. This model eliminates all laws and prohibits the state and law enforcement officials from intervening in any sex work related activities or transactions, unless other laws apply, thus treating sex work like any other kind of work. This allows collective working, accountable bosses, and workers' rights to be protected, which creates a safer work environment for sex workers and helps fight sex trafficking. The US has actually had some experience with both models. Nevada has a highly regulated, legalized prostitution system, and Rhode Island decriminalized prostitution in 2003. According to University of California's research, instances of reported rape and sexually transmitted diseases plummeted after Rhode Island stopped policing prostitution. Nevertheless, Rhode Island outlawed prostitution again in 2009. Many organizations have called on states to decriminalize sex work in global effort to tackle HIV/AIDS epidemic and ensure sex workers access to health services. Almost all organizations run by sex workers themselves around the world favor decriminalization of sex work. The majority of academics in the US, UK, and elsewhere also favor decriminalizing sex work. In June 2003, New Zealand became the first country to decriminalize sex work with the passage of the Prostitution Reform Act. Despite decriminalization, the industry remains controversial, with some issues remaining. This makes sense because while decriminalization is a helpful first step, it doesn't instantly remove the stigma tied to sex work, especially when decriminalization hasn't been adopted globally. It's only that one country. Like I said before, the true problem lies at the core. When we resolve those issues, we'll see major change. For now, I believe decriminalization is a step forward towards that. But how about you guys? What do you think? You're welcome to drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. I really did try to keep it short, believe it or not. There's just so much information to cover. I honestly could have gone more in depth. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell to be notified when I post another juicy vid. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.